my beautiful loves, and welcome back to another episode of Soulful Wahine. I want you to picture this for a second. You finally have walked away from someone who's hurt you. Maybe it took months. Maybe it took years. Maybe it took everything in you to walk away and leave that person. And then one day, you find yourself missing them. Not because you have forgotten about what had happened, not because you suddenly think that the relationship was healthy, but you just miss them. And that realization can be very confusing because if leaving was the right decision, why does my heart still ache? Why does my heart still think about this person from time to time? I don't want to spend today's episode convincing you to stop missing whoever that person may be. But rather, I want us to get curious about what your heart might actually be grieving. Because sometimes we're not mourning the person, we're mourning something that is much harder to put into words. And I think once we can name what we're truly grieving, we can begin to understand why letting go has never been as simple as just walking away. And so today, we're going to be diving into why do I miss people who have hurt me? In my opinion, when we miss people who have hurt us, it's honestly one of the most confusing parts of a healing journey. We finally leave, we finally create distance, and we finally begin to choose ourselves. So why, out of nowhere, do we start to miss the very person that it was so hard to walk away from? If you've ever asked yourself that question, I want you to know something. You're not crazy, and you're certainly not alone in this experience. I think the first thing we need to understand is what missing someone actually means. Missing someone doesn't mean that you have automatically made the wrong decision in walking away. I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions that we have about healing. We assume that if we still miss someone, that means that we want them back. But those two things are not the same. Missing someone does not erase what happened. And it doesn't mean that your boundary was a mistake. Because sometimes what we're actually missing isn't the person. Sometimes we're grieving more than one loss at a time. When relationships end, we often tell ourselves, well, I just miss them. But grief is rarely ever that simple. Grief is complex. And sometimes, like I mentioned, we're not grieving the person, but rather we're grieving the relationship. Sometimes we're grieving the routine. Sometimes we're grieving the future that we thought we were building. And sometimes we don't even know what we've lost. Which is why I think it's important for us to slow down before assuming what our heart is actually trying to tell us. As I mentioned, sometimes it's not the person that we miss. We miss the possibility of who we hoped that they would become. And that's a very different kind of grief. Because now you're not only mourning who they were, you're also mourning every promise, every possibility, and every future you imagine that the two of you may have. And that, in my opinion, folks, is a very hard and heartbreaking realization. However, once we realize that, we can begin to start asking different questions. Okay? A question that comes to mind when we're talking about this is, were you grieving the person or their potential? Maybe you kept waiting for the apology, or for the consistency, or for the day that they finally choose you the way that you have been choosing them. And when that day never comes, it isn't just the relationship that ends. Usually, the hope ends too. And hope can be incredibly difficult to let go of. I know that that's very accurate for me. So, again, as you listen to this episode, folks, please know and recognize that you are not alone in any of this. Okay? Hope has a way of keeping us emotionally invested. Not because we're weak, but because hope asks us to imagine what could be. We hold on to small moments, promises, the maybe this time will be different. And sometimes we're grieving the future that we spent years believing that was just around the corner. But hope isn't the only thing that keeps us attached. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, folks, our nervous system does not crave what is safe. Our nervous systems crave what is familiar to us. And that does not mean that your nervous system is broken, but rather, it means that it's trying to predict what comes next based on what we've experienced before. And sometimes familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when familiar was actually painful, which helps us explain why healing can feel so emotionally confusing. As I've mentioned on here, folks, I'm all about duality. And one of the biggest things that I try to teach clients is love and hurt can exist in the same relationship. One does not cancel out the other. You can genuinely love someone while also recognizing that they were not good for your well-being. And in my opinion, that's one of the hardest truths to hold. Because we often believe that we have to choose one or the other. But healing, again, usually asks us to hold space for both. Okay? I want to throw out, folks, that you don't have to rewrite the past in order for you to move forward. Meaning, you don't have to convince yourself that this person was all bad or that none of the good moments mattered. Healing is not about rewriting your story. It's about seeing the whole story. Okay? The beauty, the pain, and the truth. Because once we stop arguing with our grief, we can finally begin listening to it. And when we begin to listen to our grief, we can recognize that maybe our grief is trying to tell us something different. And I don't think that this kind of grief is telling us that we need to go back or that we made a mistake for leaving. Maybe it's asking, can we finally take time to mourn what never got the chance to be? And I think that, folks, is where our true healing can begin. Sometimes we're grieving the version of people that we have spent years waiting to meet. Maybe you kept believing that one day they would become emotionally available. That one day that they would finally understand your pain. Maybe one day they would choose the relationship the way that you have always done. Whether that person was a parent, sibling, friend, partner, or someone else that you loved, that hope, again, can be incredibly difficult to let go of. And sometimes the deepest grief is having to accept that this person may never become who we spent years believing that they could be. And while that is very hurtful, it's also only one type of grief that we can carry. And what I mean by that is sometimes we're grieving the apology that we never received, the conversations that never happened, the words that we will never hear. and questions that may never be answered for us. For some people, it's an apology, while for others, it's accountability. Or maybe it's even just hearing someone simply say, I can see how much I hurt you. When those moments never come, we're left grieving something that never had the chance to even exist. And apologies aren't the only things that we lose. Sometimes we're grieving the relationships that we feel like we've deserved. Not the relationship that we had, but rather the relationship we should have had. The parent who celebrated us, the sibling who protected us, the friendship that felt safe, the partner who consistently chose us. Sometimes our grief is not about losing a person, but rather it's about realizing that we never received the relationship that we deserve to have in the first place. And I think that's one of the hardest losses to put into words because it can feel so confusing. And maybe even sometimes we're grieving the versions of ourselves that never got the chance to exist. Maybe you spent years surviving instead of just being. Maybe you became the peacemaker, the caretaker, the one who never asked for too much. And when relationships require us to shrink ourselves, we don't just lose the relationship, folks. Sometimes we lose the opportunity to discover who we might have become if we had felt safe enough to just be ourselves. And the weird thing about grief, folks, is it has a way of revealing losses to us that we never realized that we were even carrying. Does that make sense? Another thing we might be grieving is maybe we're grieving the future that we have quietly built for ourselves in our minds. Not just weddings or growing old with someone. Maybe we're grieving the holiday traditions that we had imagined, the phone calls that we thought we would always have, watching your children know their grandparents, growing closer with your siblings, and believing that your friendship would last a lifetime. Sometimes we're mourning a future that only ever existed in our hearts. And that's what makes grief so complex and layered. One thing I also teach my clients is that not every loss comes from someone leaving your life. Grief comes in many different forms. And sometimes the loss comes from accepting who that person may have always been. They're still there, and we still might love them, but we've stopped waiting for them to become someone different. And in my opinion, that's a different kind of goodbye. That's a different kind of grief. Because you're not grieving their absence, but rather you're grieving the end of your hope that things would eventually change. And I think that's where so many of us begin to confuse acceptance with giving up. Acceptance is not giving up on people. Okay? Acceptance is letting go of the belief that you can love someone into becoming a different person. It's allowing yourself to stop carrying the responsibility for someone else's growth. It doesn't mean that you stop loving them. It just means that you stop asking your healing to depend on who they might become someday. And here's the thing, even after we reach that place of acceptance, grief still has a way of making us question ourselves. Which is why, again, like I said, folks, grief is never that simple. It is complex. It is layered. One thing I've noticed is that grief definitely has a way of making us question our own decisions. When we start missing someone, it's very easy to think, well, maybe I made the wrong decision. Maybe things weren't really that bad. Or maybe I just gave up too soon. But grief has a way of making us remember what we longed for before it reminds us of why we had to let it go. Missing someone is not evidence that your boundary was wrong. It's just evidence that that relationship mattered. But grief doesn't always tell the full story. And that is something that I hope you all can remember. There's a difference between remembering someone and romanticizing them. Remembering allows us to hold room and space for the entire story. The moments that made us feel loved, the moments that made us feel unseen, the memories that still make us smile, and the experiences that broke our trust. Romanticizing, on the other hand, only remembers the parts that want to make us go back. And again, folks, healing is asking us and requiring us to remember the whole picture and not just the bits and pieces that our grief wants to hold on to. And grief has a very sly way of making us doubt ourselves. I think one of the hardest things about grief is that it comes in waves. Some days you will feel like you are on top of the world and like you are finally moving forward. And then a song plays, or a birthday comes around. Or maybe you even hear their name. And then suddenly, it feels like you've taken 10 steps backwards. You haven't, but I can recognize that that's what it feels like. Healing is not measured by whether grief still visits you. It's measured by what you do when it arrives. Because feeling grief isn't the same thing as losing progress or going backwards. Okay? And missing someone does not mean that your healing and your hard work has disappeared. One of the biggest misconceptions about healing is believing that if you still miss someone, you must not be over it. And I'm sorry, folks, but that is just a crock of shit. Because again, healing is not the absence of grief. Healing is learning that grief can come and visit us without setting up shop and needing to be here forever. You can miss someone, cry over them, still think about them, and at the same time, still continue moving forward. Those experiences, again, folks, do not cancel each other out. And it is so important that we learn how to hold two truths at once. And that's because healing will always make room for more than one truth. We don't have to pick, we don't have to negate one for the other. You guys are probably getting so sick of me saying this, but as I've mentioned, I think 6 times in this episode and in every other episode of this season, 2 things can be true at once. You can love someone and also recognize that they were not able to love you in the ways that you needed them to. You can miss someone and still recognize that the distance is what protects your peace. You can grieve a relationship and still accept that it is not a relationship that you want back. Healing rarely ever asks us to choose one or the other. Because again, it is asking us to learn how to hold space for both of them. And I think that's why so many of us begin to judge ourselves when we're going through this. And so with that, folks, I want us to start getting curious about our grief instead of just judging it right off the bat. When we miss someone, so many of us immediately ask questions like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I move on? Or why am I still thinking about them? But what if those questions are not the questions that your grief needs? What if the better question is, what is my grief trying to show me? Curiosity creates space for understanding, while judgment usually shuts that shit down. And sometimes that curiosity can lead us to places and answers that we may have never even expected. So I want you guys to think about this. What if your grief isn't asking you to go back? What if it's asking you to slow the fuck down and to acknowledge the hopes that you carried, to acknowledge the expectations you held, the relationship you deserved, and the future that you imagined? Maybe your grief isn't pointing you back towards another person, but rather it's pointing you towards the parts of yourself that still need love and compassion in this moment. And I think that's where today's conversation has been leading us all along. I want to give you guys some food for thought. In my opinion, healing isn't always about grieving what happened. Sometimes it's grieving what never got the chance to happen. Sometimes it's grieving the parent that we hoped that they would become, the friendship that you believed would last, the sibling relationship that you deserved, the future that you imagined. And maybe, folks, that's the grief that we've been carrying all along. And once we can name that grief, the hope is that we can then stop asking ourselves the wrong questions. Okay? As I mentioned earlier, folks, sometimes we don't even miss the person, but rather we miss the possibility of who we had hoped that they would become. And those are two very different losses. And when we can finally understand the difference, we stop seeing our grief as a sign to go backwards, but instead, we begin seeing it for what it really is: love, hope, disappointment, and the quiet mourning of something that never had the chance to become what we needed it to be. So before we end today's conversation, I want to leave you all with one final question. The next time you find yourself missing someone, don't immediately ask yourself, why can't I let them go? Instead, I want you to ask yourself this: what am I truly grieving? Because the answer, again, may not even be the person. You might be grieving the relationship that you deserved, the future that you imagined. Sometimes naming the grief is the very thing that allows healing to begin. Before we close today's conversation, folks, if there's anything that I want you to take away from this episode or conversation, it's this: grief is not always asking us or telling us to go back to what we're missing. Sometimes it's asking us to honor the love that we had, acknowledge the pain that we experienced, and make space for the life that we hoped would unfold, but never did. And if that's where you find yourself today, I hope you'll meet yourself with curiosity instead of judgment. Healing doesn't ask us to stop loving. Sometimes it's simply asking us to be honest about our grieving. Just something for all of us to think about, okay? And until next time, folks, mahalo and aloha.